Righty dokie, this is going to be an assembly guide on the Meteorite Stielhandgranate Airsoft Impact Cap Grenade. Once again, thank you very much for all of the support you guys have had on this system. Copied by many, but rivaled by none. And so this is the Stielhandgranate. So first of all, you want to print the handle completely solid. On my personal one, I have actually done it with like 8 or 9 walls or something like that, and there's a small gap of infill. But the new ones I do 100% infill, 0.12 I think, 0.12 layer height or 0.18 layer height. Got a bit more mass behind it, so just be careful with that. Don't throw it like a tomahawk. The head, you can probably do what you would normally do with the Meteorite bodies, which is 4 walls is what I tend to recommend, with 20% infill, and I've got a fuzzy effect on it, 0.24mm layer height. And this one is, I'm sure the person watching this will recognise their order. I've also got some string for the fuse. I've actually got some, I believe this is Builder's chalk line. It's a nylon, I think nylon, or it's a synthetic braided line which is used. This is 1mm in diameter. It's rated for about 160 pounds breaking strength, so this should not snap even if you're swinging off it. There's 2 of these. I'm only going to do one for the video, and I'm going to nick that key, or that spoon, sorry, out of that one. I've got another one on the way. And so I've got all the supports off. I'm just going to use my 11mm knife to trim off any bits of crap still in there. And we've also got the end supports removed. There's a bit of the support interface left, so we're going to trim all that off. This assembles in pretty much identical to all of the other Meteorite fuses. It uses the same 5x50mm bolt with the spring that you can bend to lock into that groove. You don't have to bend the spring, but it's something I strongly recommend people do to improve the fuse stability. And the Stielhandgranate's fuse might be slightly less sensitive, but I've still been able to get this to go off from like shin or knee height on lino, and on the dry ground at Commander Elite when I've been throwing this into buildings, it's worked perfectly fine. And what I'm also going to do now that I've trimmed the, so first of all you want to neaten up the threads, take the supports off and all that. Hopefully this is in focus. This one is a bit worn because I've bedded it in so it screws together. And what I also did to neaten up the threads afterwards, once I get all the support material off, take my blowtorch, I'll just give it all a quick lick with the blowtorch. We have the spoon here as well. Oh, incidentally, you print this upright, so you have to trim the supports off the bottom, but it prints upright like that. You print this upright, and then you just have to break some supports out there. And wherever you break the supports out, where you get the brightly coloured plastic where it's been stressed, the sort of white colour, if you quickly give it a lick with a blowtorch, it will revert it back to the original colour. This you print again upright like that, and then you print the key, the spoon laying flat on the print bed, so that way you get the grain going that way. I did this one with quite a few walls. If you don't do it with enough walls, this can actually snap. You've also got your locking retaining ring, which is what screws in to hold the mechanism in. That can be, you know, your standard 4 walls, 20% infill. I call this the spoon because it is the closest thing to, this is a HD80 spoon, and that of course blocks the mechanism from firing, and this does the same thing. And it's captive, it stays within the stick grenade, it doesn't come flying out, so that way it's all kept together as one piece. So that's the printed bits done. And oh, of course, we'll need a striker and a sear, which again are identical to the other Meteorite grenades. Nice and modular. And you can also change the sensitivity by turning the striker in the spring, as we'll get onto. And you can still use AEG springs. I used to use M110 springs, but I now buy in these 40 by 1.4 by 14mm springs, and then I chop them. I don't really measure them nowadays. I just go off, if you see where the cut end is here, I'll go up and cut it just about here, in line with that on the sort of second to last, before the end coil, if you get what I mean. So we'll quickly do that, and these pliers are going to need sharpening one day, I reckon, because I'm wearing them out. Here we are. Right, we'll fold that away so I don't hurt myself with it. So we've cut our spring down, and that is our main spring, and we'll bend that in a second. I use these roofing bolts because they've got a flat head, But as long as the head diameter isn't any more than, I think it's 12 millimeters, you should be alright, because if the sear is overhung by the bolt will interfere with it. As you can see here, the bolt head goes into the fuse cavity. The fuse on the inside of this handle is effectively, it's identical. It has the same style. It's just a bit harder to reach, of course, because you do need a big screwdriver to reach on up until the insides. So first of all, we're going to do what we normally do, which is stick the bolt through the sear. Now you can force this through, if you put it in like a vise or something, you can screw it through. What I tend to do though is I use a M5 tap. I can't remember the size of the bolt or something. Yeah, M5. Let's just do a bit. And I also like to have the surface which is printed, and if you print, oh yeah, I forgot to mention these, print the sear and striker at 100%, and if you do it with a concentric top and bottom layer and concentric infill, you end up with a nice solid part. And I have the base plate side of the sear touch up against the bolt head. I don't really think it makes much difference, but it's what I do now. That way, if you've got one which hasn't had perfect bed adhesion, it's all right because it sits flush against the bolt head. And you will need either some glue or thread lock as well. You don't, well, to be fair, you don't have to thread lock the sear on, but if you end up with an issue with one not cocking properly, one of the first things to check is to make sure the sear isn't spinning around, because if it's come loose and it's spinning around on the head of the bolt, it will act like a bearing effectively, and it will not catch properly. If you're assembling something like a sidewinder, a boom slang, or one of the electric fuses with the slipping sears, you shouldn't need to worry about putting any thread locker on those. And we're just going to put a tiny bit of thread locker, and then we will screw the sear up against the bolt head, and then I'm just going to tighten it up. Don't have to do this across all of the sears, but sometimes you get ones which are slightly fatter, but it's no big deal. I put it in a drill and I run it anti-clockwise so that way it doesn't unscrew, and then we'll just use a bit of sandpaper. This could also just be an artifact of my printers. If your printers have slightly different sizing, internal and external sizing, you might not have to do this. And then we'll just use, there we are, and I'll just wipe it down on my trouser leg. Make sure there's no dust on that as well. And now we should have a sear which drops into the fuse like that. Of course, this is not the fuse we're using. There we are. So after a bit more sanding, we've got the sear dropping down and hitting the bottom of the fuse on the inside of the handle. It's not getting caught up on any edges in there, apart from, of course, the catch on the fuse. But that's fine, because that's what it's supposed to do. We're now going to take our striker, and we're just going to put our tap about 3/4 of the way through. That way the last bit is not threaded, so that way you've got something for the screw to bite into. And next up, we're going to bend the spring. Now what you want to do is you want to heat sort of the first, I don't know, 5 mil of the spring. Then you take your pair of combination pliers and you can flatten the spring out to make a little leg. And then we bend it at a 90-degree angle to the end of the spring. So there's our little leg. Then we'll heat the same pace again, and then we'll bend it at a 90-degree angle. And then what we will also do is we'll just neaten it up, make sure it's not sticking, it's not leaning over too much. And we'll also want to make sure that the spring is still circular at the end, if you get what I mean, so it's not sticking out too far. I'll try not to burn myself whilst I'm doing this. So we'll heat the little elbow now, the little the bend on the spring, and then if we grip it and twist the spring, we can pull it inwards. There we are. So the bent spring, bent bit of the spring is slightly within the sort of external diameter, if you get what I mean. So what we'll do now is we'll trim this down a bit. We'll leave about, I don't know, 5 mil off on the end of it. Or might want to trim it down a bit further. If you don't trim it down enough, then you'll find that it might be insensitive because it'll be pressing against the bottom parts of the fuse there, so you don't want it too long. We're going to let it cool down before we put it on that, otherwise it will melt its way into it. In the meantime, whilst we're letting that cool down, we will look at cutting a section of this string. What I'm going to do is, rather than tying it one at one end, one at the other, I'm going to actually form a loop which everything can all be thread through. I'll tell you what, let's just, I want to eyeball it roughly. You want to make sure you leave enough string so you can tie knots and all that. Oh well, I've got like a few hundred meters of this stuff, so we'll cut off, what's that? Well, we've done that. I don't know how long it is. I'll tell you what we'll also quickly do is, because this is a synthetic rope, got to be careful though because the blowtorch will be a bit overkill for that. We'll just seal the ends. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass one end of the string through the hole on the spoon. We'll double it up like so. This is probably not showing up well against the floor or against the desk. We're then going to pass the string through like this, and you see these two little holes here on the retaining ring. You want to position it like that. If you get it the wrong way around, you won't really be able to tighten it up properly, because those rings allow you to put a pair of pliers in and tighten it up. So we've then got it going through the the spoon like so. And then you feed one end of the string through the end cap. And then let's think of what knot to use. What we'll probably do is just do a figure of 8 knot, known in climbing, I think, as the European death knot. So you tie a figure of 8 knot, but you do it with the string doubled up. You want a bit of length in it, but you also don't want too much, because you've got to be able to tuck this away inside the fuse, but I think this will be all right. You want a bit to be able to pull on, and we'll just tighten it right up. You want a knot which is going to properly jam and be tight, so it's not going to come loose. We'll just trim a bit of those tails off, like that. So whenever you take the end cap off, you then pull the string and it pulls the mechanism out of the way. Sometimes the mechanism will drop down naturally when you take the end cap off, so you don't need a frigging yank on it, you know, you just need to pull it down, it doesn't come out. We're also going to give it a bit more of a perpendicular bend to it, so that way you want ideally as perpendicular of a leg as possible. That stops the spring from twisting round. As I've said before, you don't have to do it. You can just cut the spring without bending it and have the uncut end, but the uncut end has to, the cut end has to rest on this little shelf here. That is harking back to the original Meteorite fuse. You can still do that, but you will have a bit less stability in the fuse. And so now we're going to take our striker and take our spring, and the arrow on the striker, we're going to push the striker into the end of the spring here, the uncut end. And we want the arrow to line up with the little leg. So we pop it in like that. The fit may vary depending on how your prints have done. It shouldn't be too much of a problem if it's loose, because the original Meteorites had a loose striker inside the spring. These particular springs, though, it's a tight fit and it seems to work all right, so I'm just going to stick with that because it works. And then we're going to make sure that's cool. Oh, we're going to drop everything. We're going to make sure we've got our bolt and striker assembly inside the fuse, inside the handle. We're going to take our long flathead and put it into the head of the roofing bolt. And then we're going to screw the bolt, I should say, into the striker. We'll worry about the spring alignment in a second. And then what we've done is we've taken the cut end of the spring and we've hooked it into the little groove on the step. Now if we look here, there's also an arrow on the base of the fuse, and ideally, to start off with, you want them pointing at each other when you assemble it, which is the lowest sensitivity, and then the further you turn the striker away from the arrow, the more sensitive you get. Now because of how the spring bites into the plastic on the striker, you can only really turn it one way, you can't really turn it the other way, so you have to go around again if you put the sensitivity too high. But now if we push the thing in, it cocks like that. But before we start piddling around with the sensitivity, we want to put the spoon assembly in that we assembled earlier. This will only go in one way. It will not allow you to slide it in the other way, and it should drop in like that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do up the retaining ring. We're then going to take a pair of pliers and put the needle nose pliers and put the end of each jaw into the ring, and we're just going to nip it up. It doesn't have to be incredibly tight, but it's just there to stop the mechanism dropping out of the way. And we do have quite a bit of line left in that, but it doesn't, I think it'll be alright. And then you just sort of tuck it in like that and screw, yeah, that's fine, that's got plenty of line. And then you just screw the end cap off, so you pull it out, click, pull the mechanism to arm it, and then throw. So what we're going to do now is we're going to cock the mechanism and push the spoon in. And when the spoon is flush and it's in a safe position, it should be flush with the ring here. And so that's now in the way of the striker, so the sear, sorry. So that will not drop down. You pull it out and it will fire. Now for the sensitivity test, the main thing, the two things you've got to pay attention to is of course the impact sensitivity, to make sure that it will go off from a reasonable height onto a surface, and also you want to make sure that it's not going to go off if it's too, you don't want to make sure that it's not too sensitive, that as soon as you pull the mechanism out it will fire. And for the sensitivity test, you want to have the grenade at least partially assembled with the head on the fuse, so that way it has the same inertia as it would if you were using it loaded. You don't have to have any caps on it. Not going to go off on the bench though, because the bench is a bit padded. So we're going to do the lino drop test that I normally do. So we've got the toolbox here, so that's roughly 22-25 centimeters off the ground. So we'll pull the mechanism out to arm it, and that fired just then. This one might be perfectly sensitive enough just out as it is. Sometimes you have to adjust them when you're assembling them. Sometimes they might need an adjustment over time as things bed in. We'll do it again, pull that out. That's good. And what I like to do is, I like to do it 5 times in a row, cock it, put it on safe, put the head back on. Don't bother about screwing the end cap on for this because it doesn't really matter. Pull that out. Yep. And I think we'll do it one more time. I think I've done it 4 times, but it's looking promising. This is where the other one's really stubborn. Sometimes that's what happens. You have one which is really like perfect as you first assemble it, then you have others which are just really stubborn. That was actually slightly less than, that was about halfway up the toolbox. So this one, sensitivity wise, is good. Next up we want to do the safety test. So what we want to do is we're going to cock it again. We're going to push the safety mechanism in. And then what I like to do with the mechanism screwed in, pushed in, sorry, I'm then going to put the end cap back on. So we're going to stow it away as if you were preparing it for use. Try and make sure you don't catch the cord in the threads. And what I like to do then is, you see the way this is leant over, I like to then beat it against a surface several times. You're trying to induce a misfire. We'll put the head on and then we'll drop it 5 times from a decent height. We'll do it a couple more times, and then we want to take the end cap off and pull it really quickly. And as you can see, that hasn't fired when we did that. So what we were doing with the drop test is we were trying to jump the mechanism around a bit, because sometimes the mechanism settles a bit, and we were trying to induce a misfire. And now that it's armed, it still fires from the required height. So this one is good to go. I will need to chuck some carriages in it for the customer, and I will neaten up and just give it a brush down and all that, and hopefully they'll be banging away to their heart's content. One thing I will say with this and the pin only fuses, with the pre-made ones, when you first get them, take both carriages out. Don't tighten the head up all the way until you've got both carriages out, because if you've got both carriages in there, the mechanism, if you try and tighten it up all the way, it can jam. Now I've got to get on with the other one, but that's how you assemble the Meteorite Stielhandgranate. And just be careful when throwing these, because they're a bit more heavier than the other ones, and don't wang them like a bloody tomahawk. Thank you as always for the support, and I hope this video is of use to you. Make sure you check out the rest of my Colts page and also fulcrumairsoft.com for pre-made ones and any other bits and bobs. Once again, thank you very much. Now I've got to get on with the other one.